I think as Rana pointed out at the beginning, talking about developed and developing countries, South Africa falls squarely in the developing category, and it shares, I guess, many characteristics with its other BRICS partners, in that it has at one end of the spectrum a very developed set of industries, and at the other end of the spectrum a large population that is almost unable to support itself. So we often, I think, in the position now, we don't have always the luxury of debating the minutiae of IP law, where you have the majority of the population, I guess, struggling for survival and completely disinterested by IP laws. In this presentation, I want to just give context to, I guess, what are changes or important aspects and developments in the South African context. And then I'll look at potential legislative developments and then important case law developments, but only in overview form. So our current system, just for context, I guess the most startling thing is it's a non-examination or registration system. There is no substantive examination. There's the standard 20-year protection. There are no patent term extensions or SPCs. The patentee has the ability to amend specification at any time. We have interim interdicts or injunctions, and if one wants to attack a patent, the only option is through revocation proceedings, and those are in our context high court proceedings. So I guess one could say that it's relatively easy and cheap to obtain improvement patents, and I don't think we need to discuss those in this forum. So then, moving on, what is probably the most important change or milestone on the horizon for us is a new draft IP policy that was published by our government. And I must preface this by saying that it was and is not a well-written document. In fact, I would have been a bit embarrassed as a government body to put it out there. I think it should be looked at as well, more in the sense of being a discussion document, and it's not draft legislation by any means, but seems to be an indication of the way government is thinking. And it does not appear to have been set up or drafted by people or persons with any in-depth knowledge of IP. So a large part of what I'll say might not make too much sense. It might seem a bit contradictory, but that's the nature of this document. What is clear from the document is that there's a strong focus on patents and specifically healthcare. So patents and healthcare take a center stage role in the discussion. And I think there's a distinct attitude in this document that public health is not being served by the current IP system, and specifically the current patent system. So there is part of this a recognition that patent evergreening is a problem. What are then the proposals set out in this document? Firstly, there's one for substantive search and examination that would be coupled with pre- and post-grant opposition proceedings. But again, no patent term extension. And I think these three, you would probably say, well, of course, if you want to be a serious player in the IP field. And then the next one is an exclusion of patenting of new uses of known products. So I think I take from that maybe the approach India is taking on inventiveness, although it's not specifically set out what that would entail. There's also a proposal that there should be a greater focus on compulsory licenses and the issuing of compulsory licenses, but again, no specifics on exactly how one would implement this and what would be the requirements for compulsory licenses. We do have provisions in our current Act for compulsory licenses, but not well used, and in fact, I guess the reason being that the courts have always rejected these as far as I know. There's a proposal for integration of the databases of our medicine regulator and the IP Commission, and the motivation is so as not to grant patents to medicines that are due to expire soon. So I guess you could see this as a kind of a reverse patent linkage situation. And for me, offhand, the problem would be, so you're putting the medicine regulator now in the position of an IP regulator. I'm not quite sure how that would work. And then, as I guess a trade-off to Big Pharma, an introduction of some form of data protection, but then again, it says, but not to the extent as lobbied by multinational pharmaceutical companies, so as not to compromise access to health by the population. So again, you would be left wondering what would be intended by that. The policy goes on to, again, say that there should be education and awareness to distinguish between generics and counterfeit medicines. Again, an interesting issue for me, primarily because most pharmaceuticals in South Africa are fairly well regulated. Their dispensing is regulated. You'd require a prescription from a doctor, and they would be dispensed by a pharmacist. So the possibility for confusion by the consumer is, I would think, limited. And we also have enforced generic substitution, meaning, if you're not aware of it, that unless the prescribing doctor specifically states that the originator product should be used, the pharmacist is obliged to dispense a generic product. It in practice doesn't work too well, or doesn't always work, but it is there. There's also a proposal that generic entry on expiry of a patent should be facilitated, and I think this is not really an IP issue, this is a regulatory issue. Our regulator is becoming even slower and more bogged down. It used to take about 2 years to get approval for a generic. I think that's pushing out to 3 or 4 years. So yeah, it's a noble intention, but not a hard IP issue. And again, there's a proposal that the pricing of drugs be addressed. Again, not much guidance for us on